Rolling. This is the FedSoc Films Podcast,
where we continue the conversation
sparked on film.
White on set.
You want to know what freedom tastes like? It tastes like this beer.
Take one.
This is, in fact, the classic solution in search of a problem.
Action.
That cannot help but be controversial.
Cut. With expert discussion and analysis. With the greatest legal minds on the topic today. The FedSoc Films Podcast. It's a wrap.
Welcome to the FedSoc Films Podcast. I'm your host, Samantha Schroeder. Before they declared independence from Great Britain in July 1776, the American colonies had been ruled by colonial charters. No one had ever written a constitution before, so all 13 colonies had to invent the entire process from scratch. As the last holdout among the 13 colonies, Pennsylvania finally declared its independence from Britain in June 1776, a month before the Declaration of Independence. At the time, a seismic shift was occurring in the political sentiments of its residents, who, up until then, had favored reconciliation with Britain. The influence of the Continental Congress and Thomas Paine's common sense, however, pushed the colony towards independence, culminating in the Pennsylvania Constitutional Convention of 1776. We interviewed 3 experts on the development of the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776 for our film, The Drafting of America's First Constitutions. While this film talks about the astonishing development of the meaning of a government of the people, we had to cut the discussion of the radical ideas behind Pennsylvania's first constitution in order to save time. But we saved it from the cutting room floor and will present it here in this edition of the FedSoc Films Podcast. This episode features Professor John Dinan, Professor Williams, and Judge Jeffrey Sutton. We hope it gives you some insight into America's founding decade. Take a listen.
There's much more that could be said about the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1770, but that's the first notable thing to say. It was notable in how they took account of public opinion in framing it to a greater degree than they'd done before.
It included people who really had never, some people who had really never served in government before. And it was engaged in implementing a radically egalitarian view of a people's government. This was based partially on Thomas Paine's famous pamphlet, Common Sense, where he argued both for independence from England, but also for the formation of simple people's governments in the states. So this constitution that was developed in Constitution Hall in Philadelphia, the same place where our United States Constitution was drafted 11 years later, and the Constitutional Convention was chaired by Ben Franklin, came up with a radically different form of government than had really ever been seen before in the world.
I think it's fair to say that the Pennsylvania Constitution, with its Quaker influence, its egalitarian, communitarian influence, was the most populist constitution. The theories of government at the time were focused a little more up to 1776 on the protest component of it. We don't like this, we don't like it sufficiently that we're going to break from England. Of course, it's a lot easier to protest than it is to actually create another set of rules that work and make sense. And you might call the first Pennsylvania Constitution one that perhaps contained a little bit of overreaction.
It was the purest example of direct democracy and opportunity for the public will to be expressed immediately, purely, and directly. Pennsylvania Constitution provided for a weak to non-existent executive branch. There was no governor of Pennsylvania under the Constitution of 1776. There was an executive council. The executive council would have a president, but there was no single executive, no governor of the kind that most other states would choose to do. And the judiciary was very much beholden to the legislature in ways that would depart from what some other states would do. The Pennsylvania Constitution really put a lot of emphasis and responsibility on the public. They wanted the public to be directly involved with governing. They wanted most of the governing to be done by a single one-house legislature. So the best way to view the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776 is the most direct and unmediated expression of the public will, and also putting a lot of responsibility on the public to hold accountable members of their government.
it did have a Bill of Rights, and it also had the rhetoric of separation of powers, but it failed to use the real teeth of separation of powers, which are enforceable checks and balances. Remember, no upper house, no governor, no veto power, no independent courts. So it had a Bill of Rights, it had the rhetoric of separation of powers, but no way to enforce these things. Finally, it created a very interesting body called the Council of Censors. And this was an attempt to police the way the all-powerful legislature would operate, and also to evaluate after 7 years how the Constitution was operating. So the idea of some sort of a checking mechanism was in there, but it was subject to sort of ordinary politics and turned out to be pretty ineffectual.
So on one hand, Pennsylvania's Constitution of 1776 was applauded by some in Pennsylvania and by some outside of Pennsylvania. On the other hand, Pennsylvania's 1776 Constitution was heavily criticized by Pennsylvanians, Benjamin Rush, John Dickinson, James Wilson, among the leading Pennsylvanians who had very different views on Constitution framing and believed that their state had just made a big mistake. And the Pennsylvania Constitution was also heavily criticized outside of the state. John Adams was the most notable critic, and he put pen to paper criticizing what Pennsylvania had done.
The system did work, but it did not work very well. Again, there was no way for people, for example, people who had sided for the British, the legislature provided that their property would just be taken from them summarily. What were they going to do? Ask the governor to veto that law? There was no governor. There was no veto. Go to court? Try to enforce the Bill of Rights, their property rights? The courts were dependent. If they had gone against the legislature, they would have been removed from office. So people in Pennsylvania and also people up and down the seaboard who were watching this, and even people in Europe, saw that this model of a radical people's government was really pretty unworkable as a government for people who had different interests, different philosophies of government, different religions, and it actually engendered violence in Philadelphia and extreme disagreement over the future of this constitutional experiment.
The fact that you have this gap from 1776 to 1787 allows for all kinds of trial and error within the states. So Pennsylvania illustrates this point quite well. So they're one of the first states to put together a constitution. It's very populist, not a lot of separation of powers, and it did not work very well. So they go back to the drawing board and they create a constitution pretty quickly, within a decade or a little more than a decade, that does have separation of powers, does have a stronger executive branch, ultimately introduces bicameralism in the legislature, that's more separation of powers, more independent judiciary.
On the other hand, this Pennsylvania Constitutional Convention did establish the important second step in the development of American constitutionalism. Not only was there going to be a constitution, a higher law above ordinary politics and law, but the people who were going to write that constitution were separately elected by the citizens. So it was a partial success. It had some other elements that were viewed favorably 11 years later when the U.S. Constitution was drafted.
So Pennsylvania have very conspicuous, healthy protection of individual rights, but very populist, and you would call it very weak separation of powers. You would say almost all authority was in the legislature. Another feature of these early constitutions, and it shows how populist they were, how distrustful they were of government, is that so often the terms were just for 1 year. And if they weren't for 1 year, it wasn't a whole lot more. So that this was the way they were going to ensure that the governors were paying attention to the governed.
Pennsylvania's radical construction certainly appealed to some elements of the American public, but its populist sentiments proved unworkable. Ultimately, the Constitution was superseded in 1790. Its influence, however, is undeniable. Many states mimicked aspects of its structure and features, and certain aspects were even picked up by the federal Constitution, where they persist to this day. I hope you enjoyed this cutting room floor edition of the FedSoc Films Podcast. If you want to learn more about the development of constitutional thought in the American colonies, you can watch the rest of our film, The Drafting of America's First Constitutions, on YouTube or at fedsoc.org. That's FEDSOC.org. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for more episodes of the FedSoc Films Podcast. And please leave us a review and let us know what you think. As always, the Federalist Society doesn't take any positions on the issues discussed. That's a wrap.
This has been a FedSoc audio production.